Nice. Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome. I can see you all. Hello from New Orleans. Hello from everywhere. You guys are everywhere. I'm in New Jersey. My name is Katie. For those of you I haven't met, I'm a pastry chef, and also I teach baking classes here with Michaels, which is always so much fun every week. So thank you for joining me. Those I've seen before, welcome back. Today's going to be very delicious. This is a classic, delicious bun that could technically pass as breakfast. So always a good thing. But today we're making brioche and we're turning it into Maritozzi. My Italian accent is not great. So if any of you are Italian, feel free to correct me. But oh, thank you, Tina. That's very kind. Yes, welcome to my kitchen. I'm here at home, which is so much fun. But today we're making brioche from scratch. If anyone is baking along, just as a heads up, there are several points along the way where this dough needs to rest and rise. So I have some like swap outs along the way, but if you are baking along, feel free to break along until the time that it makes sense and then pause. And this video will be posted to YouTube within 48 hours. So if you forget anything, you can always come back and check it out later. But very straightforward recipe. We're making brioche from scratch. I've got my stand mixer with a hook attachment. Then we're going to be filling that brioche with whipped cream. It's so delicious. This is Maritozzi. It's a Roman dessert, not really dessert, more of like a breakfast. But it was given by suitors to their, supposed like future lovers or married people as like a proposal, like a sweet thing to give to someone you love, is what I'm trying to say. But they're very sweet buns and they're very delicious. So when you're ready, you can come down. I'll show you what I'm working with. It's so yummy. So very basic ingredients. And we sort of talked about, somebody was asking before class started about eggs and different sizes of eggs. And we will talk about that for sure, because I know eggs right now are like such a problem item to get. And so many of these baking recipes rely on eggs. So we will talk about that a little bit today. But I am working with mainly pantry staples. And brioche is kind of a classic enriched dough where you really do rely on butter. So somebody asked if they could swap out their butter for oil. For brioche, I definitely recommend going with butter. So it's not going to change the consistency of your dough at all. It's going to keep it really buttery and feathery and just beautiful. You can also use something like a plant-based butter. You can make swap outs like that if you need to. But butter is very important today. And on the topic of butter, my butter is softened. You'll notice I've got a smaller amount. I'm actually doing half the recipe because I prepped half earlier. So I've got 5 tablespoons of butter here. But you will see in the recipe that was shared in the chat, and maybe we could share it one more time. You have 10 tablespoons of butter here in this recipe, and it's going to make about 6 buns. So if you want to increase or decrease accordingly, you can definitely do that. And eggs for egg beaters, you could. Yeah, definitely. That would be a good substitute, yes. But my butter is softened, so you want to be able to press your butter. It should sort of give under your fingertips. We don't want to get to the point where it's super soft and almost melty, because that is going to affect the consistency of your dough as well and just make it a little stickier and harder to work with. So really just leave your butter at room temperature for an hour or two, should be plenty. If you do leave it out overnight, that's fine. Just make sure it's not overly softened by the time you're ready to work with it. And on the subject of eggs, we've got so many good egg questions. Yes, you can use egg beaters in the place of eggs if you want to. You want to make sure your quantities are the same. So in the recipe, it's calling for large eggs. If you have medium eggs or extra large eggs, the weight of each egg is going to differ slightly. If we talk about the weight in something like grams, if you use a kitchen scale, it's about, let's say, 10 grams more for an extra large egg versus a large, 10 grams less for a medium egg. So if you are working with medium eggs, you'll see 3 eggs are going into the dough. 1 is just used for egg wash. You might need even as much as 4 eggs to kind of make up that difference and get your dough to the right consistency. So if you do have a kitchen scale, it's a great reason to use it. Each egg is about 50 grams when you talk about a large egg. So make sure that you reach about 150 grams when we're talking about the quantity of total eggs for the dough. I'm working with bread flour today. Now, you could also use all-purpose if you want to, but the beauty of something like bread flour is it has a higher protein content. So higher protein equals a stronger dough. It kind of builds up the gluten formation as you work your dough, and it's going to kind of come together a bit easier. It's also going to get that really good elasticity that we're looking for and extensibility. We'll talk about that later. But all of this is important when you're making something like brioche or any bread dough in general. So if you do have the option of using a bread flour, I do definitely recommend it. It kind of makes everything a little bit nicer. I've got granulated sugar. Now, the funny thing about this recipe is that this brioche could be sweet. It could also be savory. So if you want to turn this brioche into hamburger buns, let's say, you could even cut back on your sugar a little bit. I've got well, I'm having it, so I've got 1 tablespoon, but really it's 2 tablespoons for your recipe. You can even take that down to 1 tablespoon or 2 teaspoons if you're looking to make sort of a savory version of these buns as well. Since since eggs are so, Jennifer said since eggs are so expensive, she had to take out a second mortgage on her house. I'm with you on that one. It's crazy. I went to the grocery store the other day and eggs were $10 for a dozen, and I was so upset. It's very upsetting. All right, kosher salts, super important. Try not to cut back on your kosher salt quantity unless you really need to. But salt is really important when you're making bread dough. It enhances the overall flavor. It also helps with the gluten formation and everything. It just kind of ends up a little bit nicer. You get more even browning, and everything is just more beautiful with salt. So if you can, just do that full quantity of salt. And when we think about yeast, so this is, I believe the recipe is calling for instant yeast. Today I'm working with active dry. And the difference is, so active dry, hence in the name, you want to activate your yeast before you use it. Something like instant, you can kind of pop it in your bowl and use it right away. So I'm using active today because I'm going to let my dough rise overnight, the dough that I'm making now. If you're looking to work with your dough right away, I definitely recommend instant yeast, and that's why the recipe calls for it. Something with a longer rise time, and we'll talk about rises as we get into the fermentation stage of this recipe. I would definitely opt for active instead. And so to activate active dry yeast, I am going to add some warm milk. You'll notice the one thing I'm missing here is milk. I've got my milk here and it's just warmed slightly on the stovetop. You don't want it to be hot, but you want to just be able to take your finger and kind of go in there, and it should feel like a nice warm bath, something that you would be comfortable soaking in. That's the temperature that you want for yeast. Yeast, of course, is a living organism, so it's important to make it as comfortable as possible. So a nice comfy temperature is important when you're working with yeast. So I'm going to go ahead and get that into my bowl. If you're using instant yeast, you can totally skip this step. You could basically just add your yeast in with your cold milk and your eggs, and you don't have to worry too much about it. But for active yeast, I'm just going to kind of get it in there and give it a swirl, and then just cover it up for a couple minutes. And we're going to look at what it looks like when it's ready. It's going to get nice and foamy, and that's what we're looking for. So I'm going to set that aside. And while I do that, I do want to kind of mention, so kitchen scale. So another big important thing, not just in terms of the quantity of eggs and the weight of our eggs, I know that's kind of a hot topic right now, but also in terms of flour. If you are baking and you ever notice that your baked goods are coming out maybe like overly dense or heavy, the quantity of flour makes a huge difference in your baking recipes, particularly with bread, where it needs a certain ratio of wet to dry ingredients to really work properly. So if you do have a kitchen scale, it's great to use it whenever you're measuring out flour. Whenever I'm weighing out dry ingredients, I always just grab my scale and just pop them in, because it's so much faster than taking cup measurements and kind of sifting around and going that way. If you are using a measuring cup, the alternative to that is to always spoon and level your dry ingredients. So I would take a spoon and literally as it sounds, and I was over at my mom's house the other day and she was baking, and this came up because she takes her flour in her measuring cup and she settles it. She shakes it to settle. That's actually adding more flour into the mix. So you notice I just spooned it in. All I'm going to do is take the back of my spoon and just level it off. And that's a nice level cup. I'm not weighing down. I'm not adding extra flour. I'm just keeping it exactly as the recipe calls for. So that's a good thing to always keep in mind as well. Let's see, we got a couple of questions. Can you use almond flour? So I would say for this, so any sort of bread recipe, the difference between something like a bread flour and almond flour is almond is missing any sort of gluten. So when we want a really stretchy, supple dough, almond flour is not going to give you that. It's going to give you sort of a more crumbly, kind of thinner consistency. So I wouldn't recommend swapping almond flour. You could swap a portion of your flour for something like almond flour, but I would not swap the whole thing. And that's a great question about the egg wash. So yes, to use an extra egg right now for egg wash seems like such an expensive thing to do. And actually, Nicoria, if you are able to throw the recipe back in the chat one more time, that would be amazing. But yeah, if you don't want to use an extra egg for egg wash, you don't have to. You could even brush your buns with something like heavy cream, half and half, or whole milk. If you have extra whole milk, that's fine too. The sheen of something like that is going to, oh, thank you so much. The sheen of your buns is going to change slightly depending on what you glaze it with. So something like whole milk is going to give you a more matte sheen, a little bit less of a shiny exterior. Something like eggs with egg yolk in the mix and all of that richness is going to give you much more of that golden brown finish with a little bit of shine. But you can absolutely, you can even skip the egg wash if you need to, or I would definitely recommend brushing with something like milk because of course you have it for the recipe anyway. Just as an extra thing. You could use melted butter. I would almost do that after they bake instead of before, just for the fun of it, just to add a little extra richness. But we are going to dust these with powdered sugar also before we serve. And you'll notice that once they're dusted, you really don't even notice that egg wash anyway. So if you do have to skip it, no worries about that. Let's just take a peek. So we aren't quite foamy yet. This usually takes a couple of minutes. But what we're looking for, basically, if you think of almost like a swamp, where you look at a swamp and you're like, ooh, it's got this like foamy top to it. That's essentially what we're looking for on our yeast. I know I made that sound really delicious, but that's essentially what we're looking for, is a little bit of a foamy top. So if you've ever waited for your yeast to activate and you're like, why am I not getting a little bit of foaminess? And a good reason is I did not add my sugar. Oh my gosh. You do need to add a little sugar when you're working with active yeast to give it something to eat as well. I totally skipped that. But yeah, those things will help your yeast sort of activate. And essentially what the yeast is doing is it's just sort of, it's eating the sugars in your mixture. It's taking all of those milk proteins in. It's basically having a snack in your bowl and creating CO2. So all of that is going to create this beautifully foamy top to our yeast and get it ready to go. So we're just going to pretend it's ready because at this point we're not going to keep waiting. But I'm going to go ahead and add my eggs in. So I sort of mentioned that I'm halving my dough. So I actually have half an egg plus one egg. So I took the other half and cheated and used it for my egg wash. So if you are doing a smaller batch, you can definitely do that as well. I'm going to add in my sugar. And you'll notice we're going to add our dry ingredients a little bit after we get our wet stuff together, because you want to make sure that your yeast is really happy. And if you go ahead and dump all of your salt right onto your yeast or all of your flour onto your yeast and you let it sit for a couple minutes, it just kind of dies out a little bit. So we get it all mixed with the wet stuff first, just with the spatula, and then you can go ahead and add all of your dry stuff in. So I've got my bread flour, and on top of my bread flour, just as a safety precaution, I'm putting my salt. So again, it's not going to go right on. If you've ever put salt on a wound and you know what that feels like, that's kind of how your yeast feels when you top it with salt. Now I am using a hook attachment. If you have one of these, definitely grab it and use it. If you don't, you can do this by hand as well. I wouldn't recommend a hand mixer for this. It's going to be a very heavy dough, but you can definitely use something like, you could do this by hand or you could use a hook attachment. So I'm just going to start this up here. And this is going to be a couple of minutes. And in the meantime, we're just going to sort of portion out our butter and get it ready to go. And all I'm doing is I'm going to kind of knock in about a tablespoon or so at a time, just until our dough is really supple and smooth and delicious. And the thing about that, when you're adding something like butter in the mix, and please let me know if you can't hear me as this mixer is going. The thing about that is it sort of reduces the gluten, the activeness of the gluten in our dough. So once our fat goes in, our dough is going to have a much harder time becoming really stretchy. So we want to wait a bit before we start throwing this in to give our dough really a chance to work and build up those proteins and build up that strength. And that's going to make the most feathery, kind of pull apart, beautiful texture in our brioche by the time we're done baking. So we'll give that a couple minutes. And I won't make you wait. We're just going to pretend that it's going to be a couple minutes. And I'm going to show you how to work in the butter. But if you are doing this at home, you want to get it to the point. And I do have some dough that I sort of saved here just to show you. And it's really supple and stretchy. Let's take a look at that. This is very soft because it's been sort of hanging out in temperature. Let me just pull off a bit of this. So if you look at your dough, let's see how sort of stretchy and supple this is. And if you look at how thin I can stretch it, we call this the window pane test. So you can see I could stretch my dough to the point where I can almost see through it. That's how you know that your dough is really nicely worked in your bowl. It's not ripping, it's just stretching really, really nicely. So that's ideally what we're looking for from this. Oh yeah, and Belle, you can see this on YouTube in about 48 hours on the Michael's channel. That's gonna post. Now in my bowl, you'll see we've only mixed for a couple of minutes. We've got a little bit of stretch, but it's not quite the level of this, right? So really to get it really stretchy and supple, we're really gonna have to give it some time. So at least 5 to 6 minutes is probably good just to give it a chance before we start adding our butter. But you really do always want to test and make sure that it's really stretchy and lovely before you start adding your fat. Now, at this point, if you do want to scrape down, you could just make sure everything is really nicely incorporated. And then we're slowly going to feed in our butter. So I'm going to get this out of the way. We'll start it up again. All right, and just about a tablespoon at a time. And again, this is softened butter. Just throw it right in there, and the dough is just going to kind of absorb it and work it in. And you do want to kind of wait until it's absorbed before you go ahead and add the next one. So just give it a minute or so, and it's going to work itself in. And as soon as you see it start to disappear, got like a little bit stuck on the bowl over there, so you can always go in and scrape down if you need to. You could go ahead and lob in your next one. And we're just going to keep going like that. Don't rush the process. I think the biggest thing about bread dough is, the question of, can I overwork bread dough? And of course, when we think about things like cake batters and other types of baked goods, you never want to overwork your baked goods. When it comes to bread, you really do want to be as patient as you can and give it all the time to build that structure and build that texture. And the more you work it, the more that gluten forms, and you get that really beautiful extensibility, the ability of the dough to stretch, and the elasticity, the way it kind of pulls back together. And all of that is really important. So not rushing that dough is definitely a big part. I'm going to knock that in. All right. We're going to get this out of the way. So as soon as that comes together, I've got another one. I'm going to talk about how it rises. So at this point, once your butter is in, you really want to continue on. So if we weren't here in class, I would let this go for another couple of minutes. Make sure everything is really nicely incorporated. And the risk of it is, if you don't do that, if let's say I rush the process and I just say, enough is enough, I'm just going to kind of set it aside, you just won't get as feathery and as nice of a texture in your final product. It'll still be delicious, but just maybe not as, delicious as it could be, is essentially, texture wise. But you see, this is a very sticky dough. So theoretically, you could even do that process with cold butter. That'll help kind of chill it a little bit. But what's interesting about this stage is this is the stage where you have some options in terms of when you're going to work with it next. So I'm going to go ahead and cover this bowl just with some plastic wrap. And when you're making bread, this is called bulk fermentation. This is the stage where we let our dough rise. And you've all heard that term, like let it double in volume, or set aside for an hour or two until it, becomes light and fluffy, all of those things that people say. Essentially, there are a lot of factors that can really determine how quickly your dough is able to rise. So depending on the temperature of your environment, that's probably the biggest one. If you're in a cold space, like if it's the middle of winter and your house is very cold, your dough is going to take much longer to rise because that yeast will not activate as quickly in cooler temperatures. So with that same idea in mind, if I took this dough and I pop it in the refrigerator overnight, it's going to slow the rise of my dough. And I can kind of extend this project over the course of multiple days instead of having to do it all in one shot. So you can mix your dough, pop this in the fridge 24 hours, pull it out like I did here, and your dough should be ready to go. The other thing that happens is all of the butter that's in the dough in something like brioche is going to firm up. So your dough is going to become even easier to shape by the time you're done with it after it's been in the refrigerator. So that could be really helpful as well. If you go with it just at room temperature and it's a warm day, it's maybe 72 degrees in your house, something like that. You can definitely just let it rise at room temperature for an hour and a half or so, and check the volume. You want it to kind of double in volume. So when I used to teach in a culinary school, we used to have students draw a circle with a Sharpie over the top of the dough. And that way you have a visual of when it doubles in volume, you see that expansion of the dough as it rises. So that could be a really fun way to just know exactly. I also like taking a picture of before and an after, and you can really tell as well. The important thing is not to watch the clock. It's to watch the end result, the volume of your dough after it's risen, and make sure that it's really had ample time to rise. And Susie says, I put a warm towel over the dough. That's great. Yeah, a warm towel is lovely. Put it in a warm spot in your house. The only thing about brioche, sometimes people try to cheat the rise of bread dough by putting it in a slightly warm oven or an oven with a little bit of, boiling water at the bottom to kind of steam it. The downside to doing that with something like brioche is brioche has so much fat inside, all of that butter. And if our butter gets too warm, it's going to melt. So that's going to change the texture of our dough. So you want to be really gentle with your brioche. I almost prefer the cold rise to a warm one just for that purpose. All right, so we're going to set this aside. And here is one that's risen. So if I do take it out of the fridge and go to work with it, you're going to notice that it's very firm. And so again, that's really helpful when it comes to shaping. But you do want to make sure that it's had that time to rise. So let's just check where it's at. I kind of let it come to room temperature a bit. And if we feel our dough, it's very sticky. But let me put a little flour on my finger just so you could see it. Doo-doo-doo. So you always want to be able to give the dough a press with your finger and just see how it reacts. So if your dough, if you press in and it leaves a nice indent like that, but it feels like there's some air inside, it's nice and light, that's perfect. If I put my finger in and let's say I left this dough at room temperature all day long, it was out for 8 hours or 10 hours, it's going to deflate. Right? That's overproofed dough or over risen dough. So that's the one thing you just want to make sure you don't go that far with it. But as long as you can press in and it just kind of leaves an indent and it feels really light and fluffy and marshmallowy in texture, that's a good way to think about it, is marshmallowy. That's when you know that you're good to go. I found if I do not use a metal bowl or utensils, it rises a lot better. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's very nice. You can definitely play around. You might find different things work for you. Absolutely. So I do love working with, this is like a plastic bench scraper just to make everything really easy. And I'm just going to go ahead and pop this out. Now we don't want to add a ton of flour at this point for shaping. And I'll show you why in a minute. We're looking for like really nice ball shapes. And so because I did use a smaller recipe to make this dough, I'm not going to get the 6 that you guys are going to get from the full recipe, but I am just going to go ahead and cut into 4. So for that purpose, you could use a metal scraper like this, or you could use a knife. You could flour it lightly just to kind of help you along. I'm just going to go in and portion it out. You could weigh your dough if you're really specific about getting them all exactly the same size, but you definitely don't have to. Now we're going to kind of roll each of these into a nice ball. So to do that, if I add too much flour to my surface at this point, they're just going to move around and they're not going to stick. We want them to kind of stick to the surface just enough that as I turn this dough, it's going to kind of keep that bottom seal in one spot. So if you do need to, you could take just a little flour just on the top, just so your hand won't stick. But otherwise, we're going to make sort of a C with our hand, just like this. And all I'm going to do is cup around and just rotate my dough in one spot and just keep going until it kind of smooths out on the top and creates a seam on the bottom. So you see, I'm just with a C, just kind of shuffling it around in one spot, just like that. And when I pick it up, if we look at the base, we see the seam, and we look at the top, it's nice and flat. So that's what we're looking for. Thanks, Jennifer. Jennifer said, wow. Yeah, it's kind of fun. When I used to work in restaurants, we made a lot of hamburger buns with brioche. And you used to have to be able to do 2 at a time because there was just so many. So 2 C's. So if you get really good, two C's at the same time. And we used to do like hundreds of buns. And that's always kind of fun to do. If you do have any problems, if your dough is a little too sticky, you can chill it at any point to kind of firm up that butter a bit, make it a little bit easier to work with. And if this method does not work for you, it is a good arm workout. If this method doesn't work for you, maybe you're not at that point yet, you can stretch the dough as well, just into a smooth ball, just by kind of using your hands to kind of work around. Keep going until it's really nice and smooth on the top. I'm just sort of pulling the dough, and that's it. Is your wood board oiled? It is not. It does look weirdly shiny on the camera, but it is not oiled. Just plain. And oh, so great question. So, oh, thanks, Susie. Yes, you can flavor your dough. And actually, I meant to add orange zest today, and I totally forgot. But yeah, so the beauty of a dough like this. So this brioche is sort of sweet, just mildly sweet. You can add something like vanilla if you want. Of course, we're going to be filling these with whipped cream, and the whipped cream is going to have vanilla. So no need to go overboard with that. But if you want to, you could add like a hint of spice, like cardamom or cinnamon. You could add something like orange zest would be really lovely, and that is kind of traditional as well, which is so nice for a bun like this. But anything you choose to add, you can definitely flavor your dough. It is a very buttery, delicious dough all on its own. So no pressure there, but you can if you want to. Now, the other thing we're going to do is now we let it rise again. So this is the second fermentation. This is once we've shaped our dough, you're going to go ahead and let this rise again. And that same marshmallowy texture that we had when we pressed our dough after that first rise, we want that here with our buns. And you'll notice, you'll notice today, not to throw myself under the bus, but I was rushing before class and I pulled my dough out of the fridge and did not have enough time to let it come to room temperature. So I cheated the second rise, and you'll notice today my buns are much denser than they should be for that reason. So don't cheat your rise, give it time. You want to cover this up. Usually I do that with plastic wrap just because it's a nice airtight seal, but you could also use something like a kitchen towel, a nice clean kitchen towel, like a linen one. But you really do want to give this time. So usually I would say like another hour is plenty for something like these. They will rise pretty quickly once you've shaped them, but always give them that press and make sure that they indent and they're nice and marshmallowy and light before you go ahead and get them in the oven. And that is going to be in a preheated 300 and, oh, I don't remember if it's 75 or 50. Somebody look at the recipe. But I believe it's, I want to say 350, but possibly 375. Someone will tell me. 375. Thank you, Nicole. So 375, you want to preheat your oven before your buns go in because of something called oven spring. So if our oven temperature is too low when these buns go in, they're going to kind of take their time a little bit too much, and they're going to dry out on the exterior before they really kind of burst out and create that final bun shape that you're looking for. So really do give your oven about 10 to 15 minutes to preheat before you get them in. And I will show you my finished buns. I feel kind of sad about them because I just didn't let them rise the way they should. So you'll notice their shapes are like slightly wonky, but I do have these nice golden buns here. This is my brioche, and you see they do sort of get a little darker on the bottom. That's fine, but the egg wash does give them that really nice golden sheen that we talked about earlier. So that's really lovely. And I do have a few here that are kind of ready to go. Now, the way that we are going to flavor the inside is with whipped cream. So grab that. I've got heavy cream here. I just whipped to nice medium peaks. You don't want it overly stiff for this purpose, but just nice medium peaks. And for me, I like a lightly sweetened whipped cream. So I add about 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar for every cup of cream that I use. To me, that's like a nice place to be. And I do always lob in a little bit of, this is like my favorite vanilla bean paste. So I love adding a little bit of that as well. But this is another place where you could add something like orange zest. You could add a splash of rum. You can even flavor this whipped cream with somebody the other day was asking about dehydrated fruit powders or jam or caramel or espresso. Kind of anything that you want would be delicious in these. I'm just whipping it just until it's nice medium peaks, not overly whipped. I do use powdered sugar. Lara was asking if I use powdered sugar or granulated. I opt for powdered because it goes in nice and smooth. You don't get any granules of sugar kind of risked in the mix. And it does help stabilize. The cornstarch and powdered sugar does help stabilize your whipped cream a bit as well. So that is helpful. You'll find if you're in Italy or something like that, and if you go to a cafe and you order these buns, they may be filling them fresh for you. And that's because you don't want the whipped cream to sit in these for an extended period of time. If you do make them ahead, I would say make them the morning of if you're going to be serving them that day. Or, you know, best case, you would slice them open and fill them right before serving, and that would be really delicious. We got addicted to Maritozzi during our last trip to Rome, but the whipped cream seemed different from usual. It seemed maybe less airy. Yeah, I mean, it could be the fat content in Europe. Everything has a higher fat content, the butter, the cream. So everything is a little bit more rich, but it could be also that they added something like mascarpone. You could add a little bit of that, and that'll really kind of, increase the richness of your cream as well and stabilize it as well, which would be really nice. You could add something like creme fraiche. If we talk about French whipped cream, a little bit of creme fraiche in the mix with your cream is really lovely as well. Kind of balances the sweetness really nicely. Yeah, mascarpone would be delicious. And you could use something like pastry cream. I would even lighten your pastry cream with whipped cream, and that'll make a nice filling as well, for sure. But we also have some fun stuff. I've got some pistachios. I've got some strawberries that I just sort of diced up and macerated with a little bit of sugar. I just let them sit in a little bit of sugar for about half an hour, kind of get a little bit juicy. I also have some sliced strawberries, and this is just like a little sifter of powdered sugar. But if you do have a little sifter to put your powdered sugar in, that would be good as well. Now I'll get these out of the way. So to fill these up, yeah, you are going to need a knife. Serrated is kind of good for this task. And something like a little offset spatula is very helpful just to kind of clean them up. And also, I do like using a pastry bag. You don't have to use a pastry bag, but it is helpful just to have one, whether that's fabric or plastic. That's a good thing to use just to keep it really nice and clean. So we'll start by popping our whipped cream into our pastry bag. And I'm not using a tip. There's really no need to get crazy about this since we're going to smooth it out. I'm just going to pop it right in. And I don't even think I need all of this. I got very generous with the whipped cream. Even a pinch of salt in your whipped cream also kind of just takes it to the next level. If you're doing these for St. Patrick's Day, something like matcha powder could turn your cream green, which would be so fun. And these do make a nice Valentine's Day dessert. I know we're sort of past that point, but that's cute also. All right, so let's start slicing these open. So excuse me, strawberries. So when you cut through, you don't want to go all the way through. I'm just slicing down the middle, about 3/4 of the way, just so I can kind of open them up nicely without breaking all the way through the base. I'm just deciding if I want to go this way. Let's go this way. Mine are sort of oblong. All right. So once they're nice and full, so I'm just going to open up a little. And for the ones that I have my strawberry, I'm actually going to take some of this juice, if I can get it, and just soak it into my bun just a little bit, just for like a little extra yum yums. Could do that with a pastry brush also. I'll throw some strawberries in there. Just a little bit of syrup for funsies. I'm going to load in some of my berries too. And you could add kind of anything at this point, like Nutella could go in there really nicely. I'm just going to open this guy up and just sort of force it apart a little bit. Just fill it with my cream. Try not to go overboard because we do want to smooth it out, but you don't want to go so far over that you're going to mess up the rest of the bun. So just enough. I'm just going to smooth it over just with our offset. So at this point, if you need to add a little bit more to get perfectly level with the sides, you can definitely do that. Isn't it yummy? Photo from Rome. Ooh, Karen. Oh my gosh. Karen, I'm so jealous. That's awesome. A little bit of powdered sugar. Now for something like the strawberry, I added those strawberries inside. Could put, and I do like to leave a little bit of the leaf on. I think that's pretty. But just like a single strawberry could be really beautiful. Now, if you want to dip in something like pistachios, let's open this up. Let's fill it. We'll smooth it out. And if you do make a mess on the sides, you don't have to worry too much because with the offset spatula, it does kind of come off really easily. If you don't have a little offset spatula, even a spoon or just a flat knife, something like that should be fine also. But just kind of clean off the excess and then right into something like pistachios. So very finely chopped pistachios. Just right in. Could drizzle with a little melted dark chocolate would be really fun. A little powdered sugar. Here, I'm just going to do one more with my strawberries because that just looked really delicious. But yeah, any way you want to flavor these would be really nice. Let's really load this up with the berries. Mm. Wee. And again, this is, to me, this is dessert, but this could also be something like a brunch dessert if you're serving brunch. Mine just fell. I went too far, but the cream will hold it together. Let's get a plate. Maybe we'll do a little bit of both on this one. We'll do strawberries, and a little bit of pistachios. Come with me. So cute. And wait till I take a bite. I gotta take a bite. This one sort of opened up on me a little bit, but maybe that's the one I should eat. Probably. So fun. But yeah, let me show you the texture on the brioche. And when you're baking the brioche, it's kind of easy to tell when it's done. You're really looking for that color, that nice golden brown color. You should sort of be able to lift it up and it should feel really light and delicate. Good excuse. Yeah, exactly. Let me cut. I'm going to cut in sideways just so you can see the texture here. You can see this brioche is really light and feathery. Let me take this apart. You can see that texture. It's really lovely. You can see, like, when it comes to brioche, you want those feathery shards of dough kind of running through. And it's very rich, very buttery. The whipped cream is just lovely. Now you can make these ahead also. If you prep the brioche ahead, you can save them in the freezer in an airtight container or in a nice zip top bag. Bring them to room temperature before you serve, or you can warm them in the oven slightly just to kind of refresh that tenderness. And then just fill them with that whipped cream right before serving. I know the downside, you can't taste it. I know. Makes you, oh no, you'll be in Paris next week. Oh, you're so lucky. I think Paris is probably my favorite place to be, even more than New York. And I love New York, but I love Paris so much. But thank you guys so much for joining me today. Thank you, Nicoria, for helping out with the recipe and things like that. Thank you guys. I hope you have a great rest of the week. If you do make these, definitely share it with us on Instagram. If you take a picture, definitely post it. And it's always so nice to see you guys. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Susie. Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. See you next week. Thank you.